Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Live Thrivingly podcast. Today's guest grew up in the Northern California mountains, and she took to the road to see the world and never looked back. She has lived in 4 different countries, and she now resides in Mexico City, Mexico. While living in Pisac, Peru, I crossed paths with this magical woman when I recognized her at a few sound baths and a kirtan. We got the chance to know each other towards the end of my trip when we went on a beautiful waterfall hike in the mountains of Arin, Peru. A great memory of her that stands out in my mind is when she offered me a piece of dried pineapple on the side of a mountain, and we broke out singing "I Feel Good" by James Brown. Beyond just being an incredible human being, she is an accredited medicine woman and life coach with years of study and practice behind her in shamanism and transpersonal therapy. Outside of her credentials, she is also a voracious reader and an intensely curious human who loves expanding her knowledge on trauma, somatic healing, mental health, spirituality, and mysticism. What all started with mental torture and soul suffering forced her on a path of personal healing. So prepare for an awesome episode with my dear sister, Amber Cummings. Thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an absolute honor to be here.
So, to get things kicked off, I would just love to hear maybe an intriguing story you have from some of your world travels.
Ooh, well, I'm actually going to tell you a really recent story. You and I met when I was on this trip, and I ended up traveling for 5 months. I went to Chile, and then I went to Bolivia, and then I went to Peru. And when I was in Bolivia, I was just like, wow, it was so raw and savage. And I felt like nature just came and hit me in the face in the most amazing way. I have always been afraid of heights. And as we get into our stories, like I had a very dysregulated nervous system when I was younger, and I would have these hyperventilating and panic attacks and was just so scared of so many things. But like I couldn't take a regular road trip, or if we were on one of those curvy mountain roads, like where there's a drop off on the side, that would terrify me. I was always afraid of like driving up like sharp drop off, hilly mountain roads. And it's gotten a lot better. It's really interesting, like kind of the side effects of seeing myself have a more regulated and calm nervous system. And I'm able to do a lot more things. I'm able to, kind of confront that fear and be brave more often. But when I was in Bolivia, I signed up for this like weekend. It was like a 2-day tour, and it was in Toro Toro National Park. And I had set this part of my trip, like I kind of organized my trip into 3 phases. And in this part, I was really looking for creative ideation and adventure and like just embracing kind of all the magic in the universe. And I thought that we were going to the jungle, but it turns out Toro Toro National Park is actually like big, cool rock formations, and it's dry and it's up high, like, 3,000 something altitude, kind of up high. And I was talking to one of the other participants in the tour who also thought we were going to the jungle. So I do think that they have a little bit of a marketing issue. It wasn't just me. But so I get in the bus and I like have this idea in my mind. And instead of going to the jungle, all of a sudden we're like going up a mountain on these crazy, scary roads. And oh my gosh, Jackson, I was totally scared and freaked out. And everyone in the car was just like holding on to our seats and asking the driver like, sir, maybe you could just slow down a teeny tiny bit. And it was so interesting though to just watch my own self. Like I have all of these tools now. So as I was freaking out, I began taking really deep breaths and closing my eyes and like self-soothing and, I like butterfly tapping a lot, which is an EFT tool. So like butterfly tapping my heart and And then I started seeing like it wasn't going away. I mean, this is like an hours long experience. And so finally I started singing mantras slowly. And the man next to me in the bus was like, "Would you like me to hold your hand?" I was like, "Yeah, actually I would. That would be great." So this guy holds my hand the entire way. And we get there, and then it's just like scaling rocks. And the next day, it was another really awful, just up this steep mountain road and into these caves where it was like claustrophobic dark. And we were like on our hands and knees, crawling through teeny tiny tunnels and like going down ropes. And I was totally terrified. And it was such an interesting weekend because I had asked the universe for creativity and adventure. And I was like, wow, universe, you really over delivered. But those are the reasons that I think traveling is so amazing for us because it builds resilience. Like, what are you going to do? At that point, I wasn't going to be like, hey, I just want to get off this bus. I don't like this. And what, they were going to leave me in the middle of the mountain on the side of the road? Like, once you're there, you're committed, you're in it. And so I think that you end up having to like to have these creative experiences where the creativity is actually you figuring out how to survive. And then you do, and you discover, wow, I'm so much stronger than I thought. I got through that thing that I was terrified of that, in my youth, had something like that happened, I probably would have had a hyperventilating panic attack and ended up, I used to have to take Klonopin, and then I would be just passed out in a coma. But it wasn't like that at all. It was something difficult that I survived, and then it felt exhilarating to have lived through it. And it's really interesting because I just got back to Mexico City, and there's this really crazy steep like stairs that you walk up a bazillion stairs to get to, and then you cross over a highway. And I've gone over it. I used to avoid it all the time, but it's kind of in my path. And it would really scare me. And I would like do it sometimes and like sort of run real fast to get across it. I was like, oh my God. But I came back and I looked at that thing and I was like, if I can survive a harrowing mountain road in Bolivia, I can walk up those stupid stairs and cross the highway. And I did it, and I felt totally fine. It didn't make me dizzy. It didn't make me feel sick. I didn't feel weird. I was like, wow. And I've actually had a few instances since then where I've been like around heights or doing something that would have scared me in the past where I felt much, much better. So that's a story that I'm kind of am brewing in and contemplating. Like it's really amazing to me that these experiences that I've had traveling, like how much they've transformed me, and like coming back, getting to reap the benefits and like see that transformation in progress and in action.
Amazing. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I couldn't agree more with my own connections I've made too. Like I love that you point out that it's you, especially when you're someone who is actively practicing these tools like breath work and the tapping and ways to deal with these different states that come up, whether it's anxiety or fear, and then to actively test yourself through that despite maybe not wanting to be in that experience. You do just get thrown into those. I think the last time I was with you, we were just like we were out way late in the woods, and we ended up on the side of a highway just waiting for a bus. And like things that
True.
you felt like, I feel like a younger version of you would probably be like, what the heck is happening? Like we would be like freaking out. And like you shared with me when we were kind of walking down, and you were just like, I just trust everything now, and just like it's like it, and it points back to just that nervous system flexibility, I think, and our ability to feel safe in our bodies and have the tools to work through these emotions, beyond just kind of the mental and emotional body, but actually fully embodied.
I think too, having seen myself repeatedly survive things that terrified me, it's like I know I'm gonna be okay. And having that trust and that faith where it's like, okay, I'm not crazy about what's happening right now. I don't love this, but I'm okay. I have all the tools inside of me to survive this, and everything's going to be all right. And even if it's not, I mean, I'm 40 years old. Somehow I have survived up until this point, and I'm sitting here talking to you completely well and whole, and like it's going to be all right. And I also feel like when the day comes when it isn't, when my life is over and meant to be over, um, that's going to be all right too. Like I also have sort of this peace with death that I didn't have when I was younger, and that I think becoming a more spiritual person, it almost feels like, well, if it is my day to die, then that would be okay too. And having that kind of being able to embrace that all the possibilities are just fine and that I'm in the perfect moment at the perfect time in the perfect place, like that gives me a deep amount of resilience to be able to just roll with whatever is going on.
Love that. Resilience and just the amount of presence that that allows you to experience that whole moment and live in that beauty and magic of that. So, Amber, what led you down the path you are on today?
So I'm going to go ahead and tell you like my story. I think that's
Yeah,
what we're,
yeah.
okay, perfect. So when I was about 12 years old, I started having, that was when my mental health issues began to start presenting themselves. And I stopped eating. I was anorexic. I had a very controlling Christian family that, who, you know, I look at my family now and I'm just like, they were doing their best with the tools that they had, but we were really struggling as a family, let's say that. And I stopped eating, which is very much kind of a protest act when you're a young person, especially when you have no control. Like it's eating and food is one of the very few things that someone who is powerless actually has control over. And I stopped eating at 12 and got taken to the doctors, and they were like, you've inherited the family crazy. And I come from a line of people who have dealt with really severe mental health issues. My grandmother was like textbook bipolar, and then my mom has struggled with a lot of that stuff as well. And so when I received that diagnosis, it was like, well, you've inherited the family crazy. You have bipolar, you have anxiety, you have depression, and you're going to have to be medicated for life. That was basically what I heard. And I mean, this is like the 90s. So there was still a story then. I feel like this is getting debunked, but it was still like, okay, mental health illness is completely hereditary. If you have this disease, you have it for life. That's the way it is. It's a chemical imbalance. It's like, I had doctors tell me over and over throughout my life, it's like if you were a diabetic, you would have to take your insulin or whatever in order to be well. And that's just not true. Like now we know that the chemical imbalance theory was a marketing lie, which was actually invented by Prozac and never ever proven to be true. And it turned into myth that like gets taught in schools now, which I just, it blows my mind as I've gotten more knowledgeable about this stuff, like the amount of lies that we were told in the 90s about mental health illness and mental health struggles is just amazing. The truth of the matter is that there's nothing wrong with our bodies to begin with. Like it is real to have nervous system dysregulation, and it is real to like have existential soul suffering. Like I will never ever downplay the severity and the pain that comes with experiencing these things. But it does not mean that the body is broken. It means that we have something that's out of whack, but it's not like, oh, okay, I'm a diabetic that needs to be taking insulin. That's not correct. And in fact, the mental health drugs that we get prescribed shut down our system and make it more difficult for us to actually be cognitively dealing with things and processing and growing and like doing the deep work that we need to do in order to transcend this sort of suffering. Um, but I didn't know any of that. So at 12 years old, I was put on mental health drugs. And, my mom, because she had struggled so much, and then her mother, she came from a really difficult story. And so I really can't blame her. Like, she was trying to give me the tools that she had, which was mental health drugs. And so I started taking drugs when I was like 12 years old. And I mean, my mom, if I was having a rough day or whatever, she would hand me Klonopin like it was candy. It was like, oh, you don't feel good? Here, take a Klonopin. Like it was, I don't know, like it was ibuprofen or something. It was not healthy at all. But that's how things worked in our family. And instead of it being like, oh, okay, you're feeling uncomfortable, it was like, oh my God, this is the end of the world. We're taking you to the doctor. You must take drugs. Like, I didn't learn how to deal with anything. I didn't learn how to calm myself down. I kind of joke that I got crazy person training. And that's just the way it was. And so I really thought that I was broken. I really believed that there was something profoundly wrong with me, that I had been born with a defect, and that I was a crazy person, and that was my destiny. And I lived that out. In my 20s, I did quite a bit of like life exploring. I lived in Argentina for a few years. Jackson, I have so many stories, but in order to keep this directed and focused, it was really in my 30s, after I had been kind of dealing with my own roller coaster of ups and downs, that I ended up in San Francisco, and I was in a relationship with someone who was also complicated. I feel like he and I really brought out the worst in one another, unfortunately. And I was in an emotionally abusive relationship, for both a romantic relationship, and then I feel like some of the most abusive relationships I've experienced have actually been with jobs, which unfortunately I think is very true for a lot of people, where people just let themselves, where we end up, sacrificing our own well-being for a company, for a situation. And that really happened to me in my San Francisco years, working in like ad agencies and whatnot, Mad Men style. And then I was an alcoholic. I was drinking every single day. I smoked cigarettes. I was taking, normally I was taking at least three drugs, if not more: antidepressants, mood stabilizers, benzos, and seeing therapists and psychologists, but still having hyperventilating panic attacks. And like one of my last jobs that I was at in San Francisco was Fitbit. And I would have like these important meetings with, where I acted all respectable and put together. And then I would go and literally hide in the stairwell on the 39th floor and be hyperventilating, trying to pull myself together enough to like go back to work, and having to take pills in order to do that. And it was just not a good situation. And I ended up having it was almost like my soul suffering got so intense, it started to manifest itself on the physical level. And I had an issue with my hip. My bones were rubbing together, and I had to have hip surgery. And then I had 2 suicide attempts. And after my second suicide attempt, I took a bunch of pills. I took like 4 bottles of pills. And honestly, it's a miracle that I woke up. I was unconscious for 48 hours. And I woke up, and I was so upset that I was still alive. I was just like, I can't believe that didn't work, And I had hit my head at some point in the night, and I must have been, because when you take lots of mental health drugs, like, antidepressants and things like that, and I had taken 4 bottles of pills, I must have had serotonin syndrome and been shaking and convulsing all night, probably in a position where, I don't know, without moving. And I probably had whiplash from hitting my head, but something happened and my shoulder muscles stopped working together. So I couldn't raise my arm or move my arm. So I had my arm, and then I was on crutches because of my hip surgery. And I basically lost the use of the left side of my body for 9 months. It was really intense. And that was my lowest of low points. And as I started to try and heal, it had just reached this point where it was like, I'm so miserable. This is unsustainable. Like, I can't keep trying to kill myself. I've just hurt myself really terribly. I mean, I could end up disabled, or, it could be a lot worse, right? And I think that being disabled and then being trapped in, a permanently hurt body would be even worse, And so I kind of felt like I was trapped in life and trapped alive. And I reached this point where I was like, this is too difficult. Like, I have to try and take care of myself. Like, I have to do something to cheer Amber up. What am I going to do? I began brainstorming, like really brainstorming, like making a list, like, what can I do that would make Amber feel better? And I started doing little things. One of the really beautiful things that I did, actually, it was I started taking Spanish classes, because I had lived in Spain, and then I had also lived in Argentina. But at this point, I had been back in the United States for like 5 years, and I felt like I was losing my Spanish. And so I dragged myself to downtown San Francisco on crutches. And the woman who I was taking lessons with, like, she was way better than my therapist. She got me to start telling stories about times when I was living in a much more joyful and aligned way. She had this huge, just huge curly hair that was amazing. Really vivacious human. And it started to kind of like light me up, And then I also began taking yoga classes, and I was trying to rehab my hip. I've always been somebody who liked to work out, and I used to do yoga that was like power yoga. But because of all of these physical injuries, it forced me to be doing things that were lighter and softer. And it was probably like 9 months after my hip surgery. I was finally well enough that I could start doing a little bit more yoga. And I did this thing called 30 Days to Thrive. It was a commitment to do yoga and meditation for 30 days, at least 5 minutes a day, every single day. And I had been doing yoga, but I had never meditated before. The first time I sat down to meditate, I was just like, ugh, I hate this. I remember sitting in my stupid Oakland apartment, and I lived next to this building full of Chinese people who were very noisy. I was just like, my neighbors are too noisy. This is impossible. How do people meditate? I don't understand this. And I spent the entire 5 minutes just like, in my own mind. But I sat there for 5 minutes, and then I went back and did it the next day, because one thing I will say about myself is I might complain, but I'm dedicated. And so since I had made this commitment, I was like, gonna do it. And then, so I started meditating, and it was a call to come inward and start actually looking at and dealing with myself. Around the same time, I found an old box. I've always kept a journal, and it had all of my old journals in it. And I began rereading all of these old journals, and I was just shocked. Like, the times when I had thought were like the best times of my life, like when I was living in Argentina and stuff, I was reading my journals, and I was so miserable and unhappy. And I had this horrible inner voice that was just like, you don't deserve to be alive. I hate you. You're a total failure. You're disgusting. You're pathetic. No one will like you. Of course that man dumped you. Of course he didn't show up. You're worthless. And I said things like, I wish I could just climb out of my body and escape myself. I want to peel off my skin and get out of here. I hated myself so much that I tried to kill myself. I was really living in this mental torture, this self-hatred, just hating life, feeling so frustrated all of the time place. And so I'm rereading these diaries and these journals, and seeing really clearly that I have a big problem with my mental dialogue. And then I'm in these yoga classes these restorative yoga classes where they're saying all sorts of beautiful things. And I was in one, and the woman was talking about how if we offer anyone compassion, it can be deeply healing. And she said, could you in this moment just offer yourself a little bit of compassion? And I don't know, I'm sure I had heard about self-love many, many times before that, but that was the moment that it clicked. And I began weeping. I was just like, I can't, oh my God, I need to offer myself some compassion. I deserve some love. I'm so awful to myself. And just began weeping. And I tried to cry quietly in the class because, we were all laying on the floor, hugging our bolsters, and it was dark. But then I got in my car, you know, just weeping all the way home. And I got home and I sat in front of the mirror and I was just like, Amber, oh my God, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry for how much I have hated you. I'm sorry for how cruel I've been to you. I'm sorry for mistreating you. I am sorry that I tried to kill you. No wonder you're not thriving. No wonder you're not happy. No one can grow and blossom when all they're hearing all day long is you're a big failure. I hate you. And I said right then and there, I promise that I'm going to start taking care of you and talking nice to you. And I like said that to myself in the mirror. And Jackson, that was the day that my healing journey really began. Because if you're being nice to yourself and taking care of yourself, you can't drink bottles of wine and stay up until 3 a.m. smoking cigarettes on the couch. Like, you just can't do that. And you have to say no to jobs that insist that you work, 18 hours a day, and you can't let people abuse you. And like, it was this huge ripple effect. Just saying, okay, I'm gonna take care of myself was massive. And I actually feel like when I work with clients, that's where I like to start, is just basic self-care. Like, are you being good to yourself? Because in order for anyone to be well, like, they have to be receiving encouragement, and the person you most need encouragement from is you. Like, when we came to this planet, when I came and incarnated into this body and chose to do this life, my job is not anything other than to take care of Amber's life. And I realized that I was doing a terrible job. If my job was to take care of Amber, Amber was miserable. And so I began asking, like, well, what does Amber want? What does Amber need? Like, what am I supposed to do to take care of Amber? And it was pretty obvious to me that what Amber wanted was not to show up to her job that she hated every day and like continue forcing along this path. Like, we are born into a culture that kind of gives us a formula for living, where it's like, oh, okay, you're supposed to grow up and then you go to college and then you go and you get the job and then you get married and right? And like, it wasn't working for me. I did the formula. My life looked completely fine from the outside. I had a successful looking job. I had my little commuter car. I had a shoe collection. I had a good looking job at Fitbit, but I was miserable. And so I began just trying to figure out like what would work for Amber. And it's fun. I'm going to go back to the piece of the story where I was taking Spanish lessons. The Spanish teacher gave me a book to read. And I was like, oh, this book is really interesting. It was in Spanish. And you have to have a pretty high level of reading in order to read a book in Spanish. And I really wanted to talk about it. I started trying to look for people who look for a book club or whatever. I've always loved book clubs. And there was no Spanish language book club. So I ended up founding one. And I created this book club in Oakland. And the people who came to my book club were all expats from all over the world. They were from Chile and from Argentina and from Peru and from Mexico and from Spain. And I met all of these super cool, awesome aligned humans who were living in another country, had just reinvented themselves, had chosen a different way of doing life. And I began getting so inspired by them. And as I was wanting to tear down and reinvent my own self and just saying Amber is not happy, I realized I wanted to go and live outside of the country again. I was ready to leave the United States. And so I ended up tearing down my life in the United States, which was quite the big adventure, and sold all my stuff and quit my job. And I went to Bali for a yoga teacher training, which seemed like a great idea at the time. But the thing was, I tried to just go from this really intense life moment to the next thing and just keep going. And that wasn't the right choice. I needed to rest and recover. And, when I got to a place where the long office days were no longer there, and all of these things that I'd been using to kind of distract and self-numb were gone, and in this yoga teacher training, I started having terrible hyperventilating panic attacks. It was such an intense time, but it was also really beautiful. I was having hyperventilating panic attacks and sort of spinning out of control, but I was also seeing visions and talking to goddesses, seeing light orbs and having these really incredible synchronicities happen. And it was confusing. I ended up just dropping out of the yoga teacher training. I was like, well, I've already given up an entire life here. Who cares about a piece of paper that says I can teach yoga? And I went and cried in the jungle in Bali for like 2 weeks. And that was what I really needed to do. The beautiful thing, though, from that piece of my life is I began chanting mantras. In that yoga teacher training, they talked about mantras. And I was just, you get to this place where you're so desperate you'll try anything. I was like, well, I mean, I have nothing to lose. I might as well try and talk to Shiva, And it really clicked. Like once I started chanting mantras, I felt like something was moving inside of myself. And I had some really cool synchronicities happen where I would be chanting to a goddess or whatever, and then I would walk out the door and be at their temple or something in Bali, because Bali is full of temples. And so that's when my mantra chanting practice began. But I did leave Bali feeling pretty confused, to be totally honest. And at that point, like my intention had been to become a digital nomad, but I didn't love being a digital nomad. When I left the United States, I was like, I want to live with more heart and soul, and I want to prioritize relationships and experiences. And traveling constantly, you definitely can prioritize experiences, but relationships not so much. And so I was sort of looking for a permanent home, and I ended up landing here in Mexico City. And I began, since my experience in Bali had been kind of like, shook me up a bit, I went to the internet and I typed in to Google, how to know if you've had a spiritual awakening. And then I just went down this, black hole of watching like YouTube videos about spiritual awakenings. And there was this one with this dude, and he had like these long dreadlocks. And he's like, well, if you've had a spiritual awakening, you need to go look for a transpersonal psychologist. I was like, oh, I've done all the therapy ever, but I have not gone to a transpersonal psychologist. So then I started looking for that. And I ended up at Be Transpersonal, this shamanistic center here in Mexico City, with a woman named Paola Ambrosi Sanchez, who is an amazing medicine woman and shaman. She has studied all over the world. She's spectacular. If you try and get in to have an appointment with her now, it's practically impossible. But I had really good luck. She had just come back from maternity leave, and without even knowing who she was, she became my therapist. And she was the one who, as she began listening to my story, she was like, Amber, you've done so much work. Maybe you don't need to be taking all of those drugs. And I was like, what? Because at this point, I'm like 34-ish, and I really believed that I would need to be medicated for life. I had gotten to a place where I was not drinking, and I was, doing a lot of meditation and breath work and mantras and yoga and like all of those things, but I was still taking at least 3 different drugs daily. And she was like, these are holding you back. They're freezing your brain, and they are keeping you asleep. Like, you are not going to be able to reach your full potential while you keep taking these drugs. And she's like, and if you detox off of them, you can do psychedelic experiences. Like, we can do plant medicine. You can like start going into other bigger realms. And that I have to admit that did interest me. And I was like, well, okay, I do want to try those things. But she's right. Like, I couldn't do that while I was heavily medicated. And it took a little while. When she first said that to me, it was like she had said, hey, Amber, you can go to the moon tomorrow. I was just like, what? It was really, really out of my belief system. Like, it broke down all of my core beliefs about myself. Like, my identity was, I am a crazy person. That was who I was. So to challenge that was actually very, it was very difficult for me on a personal viewpoint perspective. But I kept thinking about it, and she kept pushing me. And after a couple months, I was like, all right, well, these drugs are still going to be here. I might as well give it a shot. And, I had doctors have me taper down off drugs in a matter of weeks many times. And so I was just like, I don't want to talk to my psychiatrist about this. I don't want them to know what I'm doing. And so I just went off. I tapered down over the course of about a month. And oh my God, Jackson, I had no idea how deeply my physical body was addicted to those meds until I went off of them. And for people who are listening, the way I did it was not great. you know, my shaman who I was working with was an amazing spiritual guide and mentor, but she was not necessarily a drug detox expert. And so she didn't offer me a lot of guidance. She couldn't really help me through that process. And then she actually went to Europe and just wasn't even here. And so I found myself here in Mexico, detoxing off these drugs very alone. And I felt really awful. Like there's different pieces of withdrawal. There's the acute withdrawal that happens at the very beginning when you first go off the drugs. And the way that they work is they actually close down receptors in the brain. So when you stop taking them, all those receptors open up and it goes and it sucks up all your neurotransmitters. So people get really overactivated. And I mean, I had been taking Klonopin, which is a benziazepine. Sorry, that word is hard for me and I really should be able to say it because this is like my niche. But it's a tranquilizer, right? But when you, like, it can be life-threatening to stop Klonopin too quickly, any of those drugs, because it can cause seizures. It's because your brain has been shut down. It opens up, it sucks up all the neurotransmitters and you get overstimulated. And so it can cause like tremors and seizures and shaking. And I was so activated for a couple weeks. Like I straight up didn't sleep. I mean, we're talking zero sleep for a few weeks. But then, you know, none of those neurotransmitters are left. It's like it sucked it all up and your brain hasn't started functioning normally again. And so there's this period where you have to like, your brain has to start working again. And that can take a while. And so that's the prolonged withdrawal. And so what happens to people is they can have like this really crazy first reaction and then they can go into this really deep depression that lasts months while your brain has to come back online. Because I mean, our bodies adapt. So if we're taking these mental health drugs, like my brain stopped making those chemicals and those substances because they were artificially being put into my system. So my brain had to recognize this new problem, this new situation, and adapt and start making all of that. But I went through a few months of really, really deep depression that was incredibly difficult. And for me, that detox process lasted, it was like a year of my life, you know? The first 3 months were the worst. First 6 months were tough. About 6 months, I started sort of getting back on my feet. Around 9 months, I started feeling like myself again. And around like 9 months-ish, I was like, wow, I'm feeling a lot better. And then by the time a year had rolled around, I was feeling better than I ever dreamt possible for myself. Like I started sleeping for the first time in my life. I felt so much more in my body, in myself, grounded, clear. I didn't have brain fog anymore. I mean, those drugs that I was taking, they have all of these side effects from, you know, just feeling confused and woozy and dizzy to tummy problems to acne. Like there's so much sexual issues and all of those side effects were gone. And what's really gorgeous is I had been doing these energy work practices for the previous few years. And so I had the tools in order to regulate my system and take care of myself. And it was those practices that helped me get through that really rough time. But about a year into it, I was like, wow, I can't believe how good it was better than I dreamed possible for me. I mean, I thought I was going to be medicated for life. And I discovered that I am just fine without those drugs. But it was also very disorienting. Like I said, I really had a big paradigm shift and I felt angry for a while. It was like that movie, you know, The Truman Show, where Jim Carrey is living in this constructed, made up world. And it's like this small little dome and he thinks that that's reality. Like that's how my life was. Like I was in this dome where it was like, oh, Amber, you have mental health issues. This is where you get to play. We're tapping off all of your big emotions. You can only feel and hear. And then all of a sudden one day I realized, oh my God, there's nothing wrong with me. I don't have to live inside this little cage. I don't have to be tapped off or, you know, pushed down or turned off anymore. Like I can be all of me. And I got to live my full range of emotions. I get to feel all my feelings now. And the truth of the matter is that I'm a big feeler. Like sometimes like you get the full spectrum when you go there, right? So sometimes I have to go and live through the depths of despair, but it also unlocked for me the absolute ecstasy of getting to be fully alive. So that happened. That was 2019 was when I was going through all of that. And then 2020 happened. Dun, 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 dun. 2020 was quite the year for all of us. But that was the year that I did my shamanism training. I did this year-long shamanism and transpersonal therapy training that was absolutely transformational. And I learned to work with all of the different elements in our bodies and the chakras. And we did like intense weekend workshops every month for an entire year. And that also really, really helped me. And I've been throughout this whole story been chanting mantras. And during when quarantine hit, I had gotten a harmonium and I began singing mantras. And when we had quarantine, sorry, I'm quarantine. I'm doing Spanglish. Sorry about that. I got invited to do mantra modules and I signed up to do like a 15-minute capsule. And I was like, this is exciting, you know. I signed up for this 15-minute capsule and then they published the schedule and I realized I had signed up to do it every single day. And so I was a little bit overwhelmed with my own like jumping off the deep end there thing, but I decided to do it anyways. And so I began chanting mantras like online through the Facebook page at Be Transpersonal, and I became known as the Mantra Girl. So when quarantine ended and we were able to like start doing things in real life again, I had the opportunity to start sharing mantras in person and doing kirtans. And through that, I met a romantic interest who he was really an important figure in my life. He helped me a lot when it came to learning about music and being able to lead mantra events and do kirtans. But oh my gosh, it was also very complicated. And we got pregnant and I lost the baby after like 3 months in June of 2021. And that was really sad for me. I mean, I had always wanted to be a mother. When I had my suicide attempt way back in 2016, like that was one of the things I was bemoaning was this, you know, I'm going to be alone for forever kind of thing. It's been one of those stories and loops that has tortured me. And so when I lost the baby and my partner walked out on me 3 days later, I was just thrown into this pit of tragedy and sadness and loss. And that was the real test. You know, it's easy to be a luminous, beautiful yogini who sings mantras and, you know, does meditation and yoga when everything is going great. But when the shit hits the fan and everything falls apart, that's when you discover what you're really made of. And that was actually one of the biggest blessings because I saw how truly transformed I was. Instead of going into this, you know, mental hole of torture and anger and just all of these like dark, difficult feelings, I really leaned into the experience. I let myself just sit in the void of not knowing. And I called friends who came over and did beautiful like womb healing ceremonies on me and sat with me and cried and prayed. And I sat with plant medicine. I did a really amazing peyote ceremony that was super transformational in that time that helped me understand that, you know, this life that we come into, it's a dimension of life and death. Like we are all going to die, and no one comes and has a human experience without being touched by both life and death, whether that is a new leaf on your plant and a dying flower, or, you know, actual humans coming in and out of your life. And the truth is, losing a baby or losing someone who is close to you is something that happens to all of us at some point, whether it's our parents or a friend or a pet or whatever. And I was able to just find this peace with like, you know, this is part of the human experience and it can be poignantly beautiful. And actually, because like that relationship wasn't working that well, there was deep sadness, but there was also this sense of sort of freedom in that loss. Because I think when everything is gone and you are brought to your knees and there's nothing left, that takes away all the pressure too. There's a lot of peace there. in that place of devastation. And so it took me a few months to kind of come out of that, but I feel really good about the way that I weathered that particular situation. And that was when I started feeling like, okay, I am strong enough that I can help other people as well. And I decided to launch Mental Health Rebels, which is my company. And I offer mental freedom coaching where I talk about how we can move from a place of mental suffering to a place of mental freedom. And when I say mental suffering, I'm talking about the things that you go to the doctor and they give diagnosis labels. I mean, depression, anxiety, ADHD, bipolar, PTSD, like those are all real experiences, but it bothers me that our medical system has created diseases out of them that they can then treat and you have to pay for medications, right? That's a problem because actually the real medicine is free. It's inside of us. Everyone has the power and the capacity to heal themselves if they choose to do that work. And so I really want to talk about that. And I want to help people get to a place where they can also be healthy and well and free of these substances and getting to live their full expression in all the glory, in the full spectrum, the dark, the light, the messy, the magical. Like that's what it is to be a human. And I really try to live what I preach and walk that walk and embrace all of it. And that's what's exciting. That's what I feel like big living is. Being willing to jump into the void, being willing to say yes and just go all in and have these experiences. Like we didn't come to have this human experience just for things to just be easy. I think that what we came to do was to learn and grow. And so like the more things that we can experience and try and survive and triumph over, like the better job we are at being a human. At least that's how I see it.
Wow. Such an amazing story. And thank you for going into the depths of your story and really sharing from such an authentic and vulnerable place. Super powerful things you shared, and so many threads to be potentially pulled through in the rest of this conversation. I mean, I love that you pointed out from the start just the belief systems that you had with yourself, which are a huge part of really getting to know yourself and working to become the best version of yourself, is having to approach those limiting beliefs that we often get from our own dialogues, from our communities, from our family, from growing up in school. And so that is super powerful. And I also like what you talked about when you went to Bali for this yoga certificate training and you ended up realizing that that really wasn't what you needed and you just needed to get into the jungle and cry. Because I feel like with the age we're in, with spirituality and yoga and all these practices coming to the forefront more for more people, it's an amazing time, one, but two, I think it can get a little bit, it can be kind of, we can feel the pressure sometimes of like, oh, what do I go do? Because there's so many experiences, but knowing that sometimes like just really sitting with ourselves and allowing ourselves to have space to nourish, like maybe you go get an Airbnb somewhere. And oftentimes we don't always want to sit with ourselves, but that can be some of the most potent medicine and some of the most powerful transformations. It doesn't always have to be in the ceremonies or in the trainings and the retreats. Those are beautiful experiences, but I feel like when you spoke to that, that just kind of came up for me.
May I share something else about that? Like,
Yeah.
just playing on that thread. So we just talked about how I have been on this, I just did a journey, a travel journey. And it was because things fell apart for me again, because that just seems to, happen
Mm-hmm.
over and over in life. I can't even begin to tell you how many lives I feel like I've lived at this point. But back in December, in like November, December, I went through some things in my personal life and I found myself jobless homeless and partnerless. And I was like, well, I can freak out over this, or I can choose to make this into an opportunity. And I really felt the call once again that there was a transformational moment that was trying to arise if I chose to embrace it. And so I put all, it's funny because I look at myself and I'm like, okay, when I left the United States in 2018, it was a lot of like anger and fire and like Callie, like, I am burning this life to the ground and I'm breaking up with the United States, and I was mad and I just had all of these emotions. And this time it was much softer. I didn't sell all my things. I just put them in a storage unit and I asked my friends to babysit my plants for me, but I felt like I needed a real reset. And I had learned from my past experiences. And so the first month of my trip I spent in Chile, in this beautiful place called Puerto Varas, where there was like a gorgeous forest, and I got an Airbnb in the middle of the forest, and there was tons of water everywhere. I got to go on waterfall hikes in the rain, and I dedicated about a month to purging and releasing the things that hadn't worked, because I knew that in order for me to move on, I had to let go first. And so that was the first part of my trip. I was purging and releasing. And then the second part of my trip was this creative ideation, like getting infused with a lot of new ideas and being able to really break out of the box of my past self. It's funny though, that purge and release period, the first couple days after I left for my trip, I like literally threw up. I think I had altitude sickness was part of it, but I was like on the floor vomiting, and I was like, wow, gotta be careful what you ask for, because the universe is delivering, it is listening to me. And then the final part of my trip was rebuilding, and that was when I met you in Peru. And I didn't actually do that much building. I think that the universe, instead of rebuilding, resourced me. And I felt like by the time I got back to Mexico, I was very resourced and felt a sense of power and the ability to rebuild. And now that I'm here, I'm doing more of that rebuilding. I just found a home where I'm going to be moving soon. It's very exciting. But I do think that any transformational or kind of new chapter that we start has to begin with the releasing. It has to begin with purging and processing what needs to be let go, because otherwise we're just dragging it around with us like a big heavy bag on our shoulders, and it weighs us down.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And because there's just these different levels as we move through these chapters and these cycles we seem to go through. And like you said, you've gone through so much transformation, you've come so far, but me and you both would agree that like we will encounter another time where it's time to shed an old layer, and you kind of have to go through it again, and you reach a new awareness through that process again as well. But you kind of learn the landscape, I feel like you have, and you kind of know what best serves you when in that journey.
So think about how we are born. We are not born in this just like slip and slide, like whoosh, right on out of there. That's not how it happens at all. When we are born, it is through contractions. There is blood, there is screaming, and that, I feel like, is the way that growth often happens. It's through contractions and expansion. And you do this sort of like contract, expand, and it can feel really painful. And so sometimes we're in this place where we're like, everything's going so great and I'm doing so well. And like in some ways, my life feels like it's up leveling. But then in other ways, oh my God, I feel like I'm getting squeezed and it hurts. And we have to recognize that that's just kind of the way it goes. There's this total package thing about being alive that's a little difficult. So the question always is, how do we embrace those contraction moments? Because it's when we embrace that pain that something releases and we're freed from something else. And that allows us to expand even bigger and bigger and bigger. And without kind of that pain that helps purge out the things that are holding us back, nobody grows and expands because they're totally comfortable and everything's great. Unfortunately, we just don't do that. Like if we're happy and things are wonderful, we don't do any work. We have to get horribly uncomfortable, and so that life like pushes us to the edge, and then we're like, okay, fine, I'm gonna make a move. I'm gonna face my demons. Like, it's obvious I have to now. So whenever people are going through a rough time, I'm kind of like, okay, I feel you. I feel the difficulty. Like I feel compassion for how hard that is. But there's this part of me that is like really excited for them too. I'm like, oh, you're going through something really hard? That means that you have an opportunity and you're about to grow, and I'm happy for you. And then that's not always well received. So I try and, moderate it, but it's true. Like these breaks, these difficulties are actually the big opportunity moments.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So we could go a lot of different directions here. Is there anything on top of your mind you want to bring through right now? I know we had spoke about you've hit a lot of it with your story for sure, and that was just so amazing. There's so many good nuggets for us to really contemplate and pull through there. But maybe let's talk about living abroad and traveling for mental health. You hit on it a little bit in your story, but maybe a little bit more expansion on that topic.
For sure. So I have lived in 4 countries now. When I was younger, I did a study abroad in Spain, in Granada, when I was in 2003. Jackson, it was so long ago. That's 20 years ago. Oh my goodness. Okay, so 2003, 2004, I lived in Spain. And then I later lived in Argentina 2008 to 2010. That was 2 years. And that's when I really started speaking Spanish. So when people hear me speak Spanish, I still have a little bit of an Argentine accent. And then I left the United States again in 2018, and I've been living in Mexico for almost 5 years now. I can't believe it. So I've been an expat living in Spanish-speaking countries for going on 8 years now. And one of the things that I think is so cool, and this is an experience that you don't necessarily have to move to another country to have, but what happens when you move to a different country, especially one that has a significantly different culture, is that you realize the way it is just like a societal construct. It's not the way it is. There is no, it's the way it is. Like when I moved to Argentina, I come from the United States, where if it is 10 a.m., it is 10 a.m. And if we were meeting at 10 a.m., we will meet around 10 a.m. Like you might be a couple minutes late and you would send me a text message and say, hey, Amber, I'm running late, right? Or if you needed to cancel, you would let me know. In Argentina, if somebody says that I'll be there at 10 a.m., like they could show up at 10:30. And that they wouldn't even apologize. They wouldn't even notice. It wouldn't even matter. They might not even show up at all, and it wouldn't matter. Like, or we would say, okay, we're gonna go out tonight, and they would show up hours late, and that was completely normal. And the concept of time when I moved to Argentina was so discombobulating for me, and I felt so frustrated. Like I was trying to do life, and nothing worked the way that I thought that it should. But I was the weird one. I was in a country where like nothing worked the way that I thought that it should, and they thought there was something wrong with me. When I complained about it, they were like, Amber, chill out, calm down, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, oh. It was so frustrating. But like, I can't fight against an entire country. I mean, at some point in time, they brought me to my knees, and I just gave up and embraced the fact that I was the weird one, and I needed to adapt and change my behavior and change things. And that was a big one. I mean, time like affects pretty much everything you do during the entire day. And in Argentina, the time is really, really different than it is in the United States, especially if you're like living there, trying to function there. But there's so many different things. I mean, from foods that we eat to like ways of being. Like in Mexico, for example, people do not say no. They will just not say no to you, but they will ghost you. They will not give you an answer. They will say, estamos en contacto, which means we're in contact. That's like, okay, what is that? But they won't say no to you. And it is really offensive to them if you say no. So, for example, if somebody's trying to sell you something on the street, you don't say no, thank you. You just say thank you. So if somebody says, do you want to buy my thing? I just say, gracias. Gracias. And in fact, when I first got here, there were a few times that I tried to be like, no, thank you. And they would get offended. I was actually at the pyramids and somebody was trying to sell me something and I was like, no, thank you. And he was like, who do you think you are? You're here in our country. And like, I was like, oh my God, I just said, no, I didn't want to buy your thing. But it was because I was being really rude. Like saying no is really rude here. You're supposed to just say thank you. And thank you, if said in the correct tone, means no. So there's been all of these things that I've had to adapt to. And I think the big takeaway there is that there is no way it is. Like all this stuff that we're trained and told and like this life formula that we get handed when we're children, it's completely made up by our society. And the way the massive amount of programming we receive, especially if you think about like marketing and the news, and I mean, we are fed media 24/7 all day long, every day with TVs, and it's like the amount of programming we receive is really disturbing, to be totally honest. I like don't watch TV. I just kind of avoid it. I'm really judicious when it comes to what I choose to consume, because I realize like the things that I let into my life and into my conscious affect me. They affect everyone. I mean, now we have like what they call cradle to grave marketing, where basically they are the marketing agencies and companies and like the big companies in the United States are intentionally making sure that children from the time that they can't even talk are programmed to recognize marketing jingles and things like that. It's disturbing. But anyways, you start to realize when you break out of that and go somewhere totally different and realize that you are the weird one, two things happen. First of all, you start to recognize what your programming is. Like, what does it mean to be an American? I didn't realize what it meant to be an American until I moved to Argentina. What is my programming? And then you realize that it's optional. And that is so freeing. You know, I've lived in multiple countries at this point. I've seen different ways of being. And what's cool is I get to pick. And none of it's better than the other. The way that they do things in Argentina, totally fine. An entire country is operating that way. The way that they do things in the United States, totally fine. Entire country that's operating that way. The way they do things in Mexico, same thing. I mean, it's fine. An entire country operates this way. What does Amber want to do? What am I going to pick? How do I want to operate and do my life? And that's really cool and empowering. And I think for me has been one of the biggest benefits of living outside of the country and of just traveling.
Amazing. Just that personal empowerment you get from having those systems of living shaken up, and the realization that I can choose to follow this way, or I don't have to. I can create my own, or I can adapt to another one. And I think overall, just from what I've witnessed, I haven't traveled a ton of places in the world, but especially down in like Mesoamerica and South America, is like the idea that time is so much slower and they're not so fast. And I've heard like in Spain and Italy and stuff, it's very similar over there. It seems like the US is very, very fast. It's very fast paced, and that puts a lot of stress and anguish on us. That's just not needed. It's super frustrating at times to just recognize how fast we move and how we feel like we have to be everything and do everything and climb this ladder, where it's so much more, like they say in Costa Rica, right? Like pura vida. Like
Yeah. I think too, when I look at like the connection, the spiritual connection level that different cultures and countries have, the United States is very disconnected. Like we do not have the religions that we have in the United States, like Christianity and Catholicism, a lot of it is a control tactic where it's like, well, what would Jesus do? And it ends up, I mean, especially the way that I lived it growing up, there was a lot of control where it was the pressure to be this perfect person, be pure and do things the way that, like, in this kind of church way. And I find, like, in Mexico, it's very interesting because they do have Catholicism. The Spaniards came and conquered this country, and so there's a lot of Catholicism. But then there were indigenous religions that happened before that, like the Mayans and the Aztecs and things like that. And they all had these different gods and goddesses, and like there's a beautiful god of the rain, and so they have a lot of different gods that are also part of the cultural narrative. And they have Dia de los Muertos, in which like ancestors come back from the grave and visit the children, which is so beautiful because there's a totally different talk about death here, where, you know, little skulls are embraced and people love skulls. It's super cute. They're like charming here, where in the United States, like, that's a symbol of death. We don't like it. And people kind of have this feeling like, well, I don't know. I don't know. It doesn't matter if it's Catholicism or the ancient gods or, you know, people coming back from the dead. Like, there's a spiritual world. And so they're just open to spirituality in a different way. And there's this slowness to the culture where people still have roots, that shamanistic kind of roots, where they worship and appreciate nature. Like I said, there's a god of the rain, there's a water god, there's the earth god. Like, people talk to the mountains, they pray to the mountains. When we were in Peru, like, you would take the coca leaves and you would wave them and do a ceremony saluting, offering salutations to the mountains. I mean, in the United States, no one talks to the mountains. I mean, I don't know anyone that does, except for you.
And it wouldn't be that if I didn't go and experience that, you know?
Exactly. And so I think that slowness and this connection to spirit and to the planet offers a lot more of I'm going to say a connected experience, because
Yeah.
I think we as human beings, we all have an innate desire for connection to source. We want to feel the divine. But in the United States, we're so busy and we are so, like, disbelieving and logical and busy with work and this and that. Like, it's just gotten cut off. And I think that's part of the reason that people in the United States are experiencing more soul suffering than I see people experiencing, like, here in Mexico and Peru. And I do not think, like, the story that I just shared with you, honestly, I don't know of any doctor in the United States who would have said to me, Amber, you can get off those mental health drugs. I don't think, even the doctors that I saw who were really, really lovely and wonderful were too scared to say that. There's too many rules. It was too dangerous to even say such a thing to me. I had to leave my country to experience the kind of healing and growth that I have done. And that's one of the reasons that I've started a company talking about this, is because I feel like I want to help people in the United States who might not have access to the same resources, because I've received some amazing training and just box breaking discovery, expansive ideas that are not commonplace in our culture, but are massively healing.
Yes. So amazing what you have going with Mental Health Rebels, and I couldn't agree more. It's so needed in our time, probably globally, but especially the US. It's really something we're dealing with in such a big way, and there is alternatives, and that's what I always say. It's like the path of alternatives is so wide, and there's so many different paths to choose, and you blaze your own path, you know, ultimately, but there is another way. And just like you had that big shift when you were told, you know, that even just to give yourself compassion, like these little things, like, and it's along the lines of like planting seeds for individuals, like at a conversation like this or reading a book. It may not hit you at that moment, but when it does, it's like, oh, like there is another way, or there's another
Mhm.
way to relate to myself. There's another alternative to pharmaceutical medications through, you know, various things like adaptogens. Adaptogenic mushrooms are an awesome thing that a lot of people are getting on now. I know a lot of people are very familiar with like lion's mane and chaga and turkey tail and those, but then On the psychedelic and entheogen side, there's more research coming out there and a lot more people speaking out to the healing that's going on there, and with MAPS and a lot of the psychotherapists that are adopting this as a method of healing. Do you have anything to add to that?
Oof, I think it's really cool that we are beginning to explore the realm of medicines that are, I've been thinking about this a lot actually. I would put it in four categories. There's the psychiatric drugs that I'm going to say this in the context of mental health, right? There's psychiatric drugs, and then we have like recreational drugs like alcohol and cigarettes and things like that, which it kind of hurts my soul because those are from natural. I mean, those are like alcohol comes from natural ingredients and so does tobacco, but they've been so polluted with contaminants. I mean, cigarettes are just full of all sorts of chemicals now. So they're not pure anymore. So let's say like recreational drugs and then the psychiatric drugs, those are consciousness reducing drugs that are meant to keep us asleep, put us asleep and keep us asleep. And like alcohol, it is, I mean, I'm a former alcoholic, right? So like I really understand alcohol. It is a drug that is used to keep us asleep, and it is celebrated by our society. It's like, well, what do you do when you have a bad day? You have a drink. How do we celebrate? We celebrate by going out and having beverages. Like instead of celebrating by having deep connections with people, like we take a substance that makes it more, that like shuts down our brains. Like look at a person who's drunk. They lose function. Like they can't even work anymore. They can't talk. They can't move. And so I actually feel like the things that mainstream society is giving us, like these kinds of drugs, they are consciousness reducing. And mental health drugs, if you were really suffering, like sometimes they can make you feel better because they shut off pieces of your brain. They shut down your system. And so, yeah, if you are really in a crisis, maybe that's a relief. I'm not going to say that any of this is necessarily bad. I'm using air quotes here. Like, I think everything in moderation and in the correct context can be helpful in healing. And I do think that sometimes people are in a place where they are in such a state that using mental health drugs for a moment or a period of time can be really helpful. But I'm really against like giving them to children and having them be the solution for 20 years. Like that's not okay. So that's one category. And then the other is where we're looking at, there's the synthetic drugs like LSD or ketamine that are consciousness expanding. And that's the same with plant medicine when we're talking about, or entheogens, when we're talking about ayahuasca or mushrooms or bufo, which is frog venom. So I would put it in that category as well. It's not necessarily a plant, but those are all consciousness expanding. And the odds that you get addicted to those things are much lower, especially because they're usually used in a ceremonial construct. I have a mild concern about the amount of microdosing people do now, because I think that can create addictive patterns. Like I feel like for me, in my opinion, the correct use of microdosing is to do it for a period of time, not all the time for forever. Same deal. Like any of these things, if we're doing it all the time for forever, that's an addiction. And then the thing with addictions is that they control you. And so then you are not mentally free anymore. And I am all about mental freedom. But we're talking about like a experience, these consciousness expanding substances can be really helpful. Stanislav Grof, the father of LSD therapies, wrote that the most healing experience that someone can have in the context of like a ceremony is a death rebirth experience. And that's been my experience personally as well. What happens a lot of times when you go into ceremony is that something dies there's some sort of micro death, and it happens on so many different levels, but these substances help us open up to a place where we're able to pull back the veil and reveal some of the things that we really need to work on that are hard to get to. May I share a story with you about the last ceremony that I did?
Yes.
Okay, so the very last ceremony that I did, after you left Peru, I was there for a couple more weeks, and the last ayahuasca ceremony that I did, it was I had done a couple in a retreat, and so it was kind of like this closure, and I was like, okay, I got one more, I'm gonna go in there and I'm gonna really work, I'm gonna like make this count, and I've got this attitude, like I'm gonna go for it, you know? And I go into the ceremony space, and I had the drink of ayahuasca, and as it started to take its effects in my body, I was just like, oh my God, I am so tired. I've been doing so much. I am always trying so hard. I'm always working so hard. I'm always like, okay, I'm gonna muscle it up and really do the work. And what was shown to me that night was that it's enough. I've done enough. I've sang enough mantras. I've done enough ceremonies. I've said enough prayers. I've done enough yoga. I've had enough rituals. And like at one point in my life, Jackson, I definitely had to do some work. Like I was at a place where my dream life was not accessible for a person who was an alcoholic who was trying to kill herself. Like that you can't you can't build your dream life while doing that. I had to do a lot of transformational work. But I saw in this ceremony, like, it's not that I'm not enough or I haven't done enough at this point. Like, I have done enough. I'm worthy of all the things that I'm desiring and the life that I am trying to create and build. And when I say that I felt like Peru really resourced me so that I could come back here to Mexico and begin working on creating this life of my dreams, like this is exactly what I'm talking about. And that ceremony, I let myself just rest. I like enjoyed the music so much. It was so delicious and fun. And I mean, we don't always use the word fun when we talk about ayahuasca ceremonies, but I actually had really a lot of fun, and I got to sing at the end of the night, and it just felt so cathartic and good, like pulling my voice deep from inside of me and just feeling like the music was channeling through my body. And I left with this security that I am enough. And I do not know, Jackson, I have no idea if I would have arrived there without the help of ayahuasca, because my attitude was so different. I was like, I still have work to do. I'm still not there. And it resourced me and comforted me. And it was like those beautiful mountains in Peru and that medicine just wrapped its arms around me and said, Amber, chill out, dude. You're enough. You've done enough. It is enough. You got this. So that's why people say things like, oh, going into plant medicine ceremonies is worth 10 years of therapy. Because sure, maybe I would have gotten there eventually. But I was able to kill and let die some constructs, some mental thoughts, some behaviors, some attitudes, something inside of me that has, torments me and exhausts me. Like I let a piece of that die that night. And I mean, this was a pretty lovely, luminous ceremony. I've definitely had ceremonies that were a lot more difficult. And so I think that like death, rebirth can happen on so many different levels, but that's what happens often when we go into ceremony. Like the plant medicine helps us, or the, psychedelic or whatever, it helps us see something that we couldn't see before, let that thing die, and let a new version of ourselves be born out of that. And if we take that into our lives, into our everyday to day, that's when it's a super transformational experience. And I want to just say that I think there's these sort of ceremonial experiences and these experiences that you have with these medicines that can be big deal events. But then to bring them back into real life, we really need a daily practice. And a daily practice does not require any kind of substances. I am talking about meditation, chanting, breath work, EFT tapping, yoga. Like there's a large list. I think dancing with intention is an awesome daily practice, right? And so it's that practice where I think that's where the real transformation happens. Like these ceremonial experiences kind of shake us up, or like doing a microdose protocol for a few weeks can really shake you up and help you do the work and pull back layers and have big realizations. But in order to really transform, I think that is a little baby steps, day by day, in your practice process. And I also think that it does not require any of those substances if you don't want to use them. I think that honestly, the people who I know who have had the biggest transformational journey and who are living the most aligned lives are people who are showing up to their mat or to their, meditation space every day, not the people who are doing 5 bazillion ceremonies.
It's almost like, there's powerful wisdom in the consistency and the dedication to something rather than continually grasping at more and more and more. So thank you so much for sharing that from your last ceremony. That's really beautiful. And I think that's a reminder that we can all use, is that we are enough. I think it's the Ram Dass quote that's like, along your spiritual path, you'll eventually come to a place where you realize you're enough for yourself. And like, that's exactly what it sounds like you experienced, which is so beautiful. And I love how we can hear, other people talk about their experiences and that you've come to this similar realization. But just they work as reminders, for all of us, even if we weren't sitting there doing the experience with you, anyone that has gone through these ceremonies and stuff, listening to their words and their realizations, I feel like we receive the medicine too. So that's a big part of this podcast, of asking people about these experiences, and because I believe they can be pulled through these same threads outside of ceremony. And also thank you for kind of putting out those 4 different categories of what some people have always labeled as drugs, but I like how you laid them out. Could you lay them out one more time again?
For me, the big difference is consciousness reducing, kind of numbing drugs versus consciousness expanding. And so when we're using things like drugs or plant medicine in a ceremonial context, is consciousness expanding. And when we are using things that numb us, that might be like alcohol, recreational drugs, or pharmaceutical medicine type drugs, those are consciousness reducing. And I personally don't feel like that's a great place to be participating.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that does us well. And for me, that's when it's drug, not medicine.
Yes. I love that. And thank you for pointing out the importance of integration as well, because that's a big topic we talk about on the podcast all the time, is what are you doing to ground this experience and create a lasting dialogue so you don't continue to have to potentially go back to these things, so that they can become a fluid part of your life day to day. So I love that. Yeah, to kind of cap off the show, I like to ask, what does live thrivingly mean to you?
So in Spanish, there's no perfect translation for the word thrive. So I've actually tried to have this conversation with people on multiple occasions. And like, how do I translate the word thrive? And people give me all sorts of different answers. Mm-hmm. The closest that I've gotten in Spanish is a florecer, which means to flower or to bloom. And there's different levels that we can be living life. Like there's survival mode. And then there's the next step up, which is like, I'm okay. Everything's fine. I'm functional. And I think that's where a lot of us are, just hanging out and like, it's fine. And then there's thriving, where it's like a meadow of flowers that are just all bursting into bloom, fragrant, full of butterflies. When you are living life, savoring every drop, and your very presence is fragrant and magnetic, like a blooming flower dripping nectar. Like that is thriving. And that is definitely the place where I desire to be.
Amazing. I love that. I feel like I'm in this meadow right now as you describe it. So beautiful. Uh, Anything else to add here for the audience, Amber?
One thing that I say all the time and is kind of part of my message is that I want people to know real healing is possible. I think when we go to doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists and we say, I'm experiencing this mental suffering, the soul angst, we get told that these are like diseases and that we have problems and there's something wrong with us. And yes, it's a difficult situation like that, but our modern medical system is not offering us real solutions and real healing. And I just want people to know it exists because I didn't. I didn't know that that was possible. I had to do this really wild and crazy voyage to get to a place where somebody suggested that maybe I could be okay, that I could heal myself. And so part of the reason I desire to share my story is to just let people know if I can do it, this girl, this crazy alcoholic who was like hospitalized for kneeling in the street screaming, like if I can do it, it's possible for you too.
Aho. Well, thank you so much for being here today. Would you mind letting the audience know where they could find you?
Yes, I post on social media. So I'm often offering content and goodies on Instagram at Mental Health Rebels. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. I have a TikTok, but I have to admit I haven't really gotten that deep into TikTok. But I'm doing my best. I'm doing my best with the social media. And I also have a website. I just launched an about page that has this whole story written out that I'm really excited about. So I'm actively working on growing there. And I offer mental freedom coaching, which it's a great solution for people who are looking to avoid taking psychiatric drugs for mental suffering, or people who are experiencing mental suffering and are just curious about other different options and finding energy work practices that work for them, or for people who are going through the process of detoxing off their mental health drugs. Like I would really love to help people through that. I'm not a doctor, so I do not offer medical advice. Like I'm not going to tell someone how to taper off drugs or things like that. But doctors can offer that kind of advice. I think doctors don't have like the compassion to understand how difficult that process is, how it feels to live through that process. So I help support people through that on a more spiritual level and help them with coping strategies that are holistic and just navigating that entire journey, because it's a gnarly one sometimes.
Amazing. And I will link these down in the description below so people can find them. Well, thank you so much, Amber, for showing up here today, and your laughter and your light and your amazing stories and wisdom you shared. So happy that you made time to be on here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It feels really delicious to share my story and have it be received. It's really nice to be here, Jackson.